Oh, and I see Carter on there too. Carter.
Hello.
Before I get started, I'm getting a little feedback from someone's audio. If you're on, could you just make sure you're muted? I'll try to find anyone who isn't. Should be good. Okay, well, thanks everyone. I am going to kick off this live speaker series. We are excited today. We're joined by Markus and Carter, who are both on the team over at Google. And we're having a discussion with Markus and Carter, myself and Jessica Rearder on the GitLab team about building internal culture, what that looks like for individual contributors, for managers, for executive level leadership, and the importance of doing that here at GitLab and on an all remote team. Before we get started, I'm just going to go over a bit of like the structure of the call. So if you haven't been on a live speaker series before, this is an initiative that the L&D team does every so often when we run into great people that we want to bring to chat with our GitLab team. In the agenda, you'll see a little bit about why we're having this call, a link to a feedback issue, and some related GitLab links if you want to follow up and read more about this afterwards. We're going to spend the first bit of the call going through sort of like a fireside chat between myself, Jessica, Carter, and Markus with a few predetermined questions. And when we're done, we'll open it up to an AMA. So if you have questions that you think of as we go, feel free to drop them in the participant questions section of the doc, and we will get to them when we get to them. And then I'm recording this call and I'll post it in the handbook afterwards. So if you have to drop or if you want to rewatch it later, it will be there and we will share it on Slack for the call. Jessica put a link to the agenda in the chat too. So thank you for doing that. And great. So before we get started with the first question, I'd love if Carter and Markus want to just say a quick hello and introduce yourself, maybe what you do at GitLab and at Google, sorry, and where you're calling in from.
Hey, I can start. Super excited to be here. My name is Markus Mühlbauer. I'm dialing in from Germany, Munich, and I'm with Google since surprisingly 15 years. And I have seen the company growing from, I think back then, roughly 4,000 people, like a very different company, different culture, different everything. And my current role is like product management. We built and designed a lot of internal infrastructure, products, services, and we think a lot about like how does the work we are doing, our products, influence culture, and we have a dedicated team focusing on culture topics in the company. And with that, handing over to Carter, who is that team.
Hi, Markus. So hey everyone, I'm Carter. I'm the program lead of our internal community management team and the owner of 2 dogs, which I will inevitably have to help here in a second. Here's one. She has the cone of shame. She had some cosmetic surgery. She's fine. Basically, my team helps create healthy internal communities at Google. We started about 3 years ago, and we apply external community management best practices internally, primarily in our non-work spaces. We're answering questions like, how do we empower Googlers to own their own communities more successfully? How do we apply moderation to react to content that violates our guidelines? How do we keep conversation open throughout all of that? And then also, how do we reward it inside of our performance reviews as well as community contributions? So that's the team that I have. It's super, super fun, and I'm thrilled to be here. Great. And yes, they are adorable.
They are, yeah. Thanks so much, both of you, for the introduction. I'm going to pass it over to Jessica, who's going to ask our first fireside chat question.
Yes, and I'll also mention that showing your dogs on camera at GitLab is a big way to instantly win a ton of fans, so good job. So this is actually my 3rd conversation with Carter and my 2nd with Markus. We've had an event a while back and we just sort of found that we were thinking about things in a lot of the same ways. The main difference being the size of the companies that we work at. And so I'm really excited to have you here. Thanks for talking about culture at scale. It's something I think we're all pretty excited about. So the first question is about communication. There are many ways that we communicate with each other: text, video, in person, but then also what's listed here is like cross-cultural communication. So can you talk a little bit about the different ways that we use communication, the way you use communication, and how that influences your culture?
I can start. I think the biggest role of communication in the context of culture is like building trust between like the individuals and the company and the team and leadership. So in the early days, what we did, we had like this one giant like TJF meeting in one of the main offices. Like this was like the best possible, very high fidelity experience, everybody in one place. Only possible if you're a small company, and in your case, not a remote company, right? So that model was kind of outgrowing itself very quickly as the company was growing. We even had like the initial growing pains around like the gravity point was Mountain View. People still kept doing that despite we have opened offices in many other regions across the globe. So even like moving to the next level of like different communication is a very difficult thing. And what you also see as a company is growing, both in size and like in complexity, like different business lines, different things we're doing. To really land a message, you have to use multiple kind of mechanisms, like content formats to reach people. And you have to repeat the same message over and over again, right? And like we even are seeing some like user generation kind of different communication styles and preferences. It might be like a stereotype of like younger generation people joining the company. They might use TikTok and video a lot more in their private life. So they might expect the company also to talk to them over like video and like more engaging kind of communication methods, not just emails. But you need both. Like I have lots of people on my team who don't want videos because they think, well, I can browse an email in 15 seconds, but it takes me 5 minutes to watch a video. So the best thing is to actually do both and really provide some diversity in how you communicate.
Yeah, what this question spurred up for me was, what does communication even mean, and what kind of it does your company want to have? One of the genesis moments of the internal community management team was Google asking the question, what kind of conversation is okay? Do we allow non-work discussion, or do we allow only work discussion? What will it take to have successful engagement at the scale that we are, kind of about anything, and where are the mechanisms we have to keep those conversations productive and respectful? For team chats, for aliases, for any of the work that you need to do to get your job done, managers are present, and that makes a ton of sense. But what about the other spaces that existed for 20 years, but no one actually felt ownership of it? So one of the ways that our team helps is that everyone has all these like productivity themed chats, right, where everyone can help each other and everyone can talk about, I don't know, Python is something that exists, they tell me, and it helps you get your job done. But how do we make sure that that's a good space, and then how do we also reward it as well? And how do we not say this is the one way to communicate, but instead empower people to set their own guidelines in their own spaces for what works for them, while still adhering to basic community guidelines. But yeah, it's one of those things where my first thought is, well, what kind do you even allow?
I have one more interesting thought around like there's one question part around like the cross-culture implications. That's an interesting one for me, being like remote and like not native US. A lot of the communication we're doing is very US centric as a US company, so that's clear. But there are some topics, often very sensitive topics around, like, one example is inclusion. If we have a lot of inclusion emphasis on what we do as a company, both inside the company and externally. But the way of you talk and express inclusion topics in US is very different from maybe EMEA, where like the minority groups are very differently composed, right? Like people of color is a very specific topic. Well, it's globally, but like there are many more minority groups we would actually loop into those conversations if we would look into like EMEA countries, and like same true for Asian countries for sure. So those aspects of how to truly become a global company in the way you communicate, in the way you build these like inclusion programs, which is a value asset of a company, is getting a lot more complicated.
Yeah, that's a really good call out. One thing I was thinking as you were both answering is like you have all of these ways and channels that you're communicating with each other, and you have different communities that are being set up and people are setting their own guidelines, and pretty soon you just start to have things become decentralized and maybe a little bit of disconnected, and it may be harder to keep the unity. I guess that leads right into Samantha's next question, so I'll turn it back to you.
Yeah, I was just about to say that, Jessica. Thanks for that discussion, and it does lead into this next question, because I think that you kind of spoke to it. I think specifically you did, Markus, about how much how the way that you have changed, the way that the company communicates has changed as you've grown. And I'm curious about like what are some of the biggest risk factors that you've identified in that growth, and then maybe like if you have an example or even like a way that you mitigated or resolved that risk. The conversation there too.
It's a very interesting question. I'm not sure if I would talk about a risk factor here. I think it's an awareness issue, right? In many ways, you always believe that the current company culture will just carry on as you grow, and it does not, right? Like there's a very interesting like stepping curve, if you will, as you grow, and like certain aspects of your culture will just not scale as you're getting more people or more offices or more distributed. An interesting one in that case is like information transparency. Like Google was always very proud of like everybody can see everything, and like with everything we actually meant everything back in the old days. Like every document was like open to everybody by default. That model at some point will break, right? And it doesn't even take like leaks and stuff like that. It's just you overwhelm people with too much information. You can't really know if the information you put out would land the same way you anticipate, because in the old days, everybody at Google was about making search awesome, right? Now we have many more teams, so the context isn't even there, right? So we need to basically break down into smaller chunks and like be a lot more rigid around like who can access what. What I've seen, like you need to get ready at some size to really set very explicit norms as a company and how you want to operate, and you need to get ready to nudge and even enforce them at some point, right? Like it's very important that everybody knows about like what is okay at a company to do and what's not. And there are many more of these like interesting aspects. Like at some point, your company might even turn from only being a value-driven company, which is like the purest form of a great company, right? You want to have this shared value. But at some point, there will be kind of value and business-driven, right? As you go to you grow to certain revenue size and stuff like that. Same goes for like decision making. We are coming from a very consensus-driven, very bottom-up decision-making process. Again, it does not really work at a certain size. So you need to basically find the right balance between like bottom-up ideation and top-down decision making. So there are many of these decision points you will go through as a company where you need to explicitly and thoughtfully kind of update, not change, but like update your value statements and the way you kind of implement them.
Yeah, Markus, I totally agree. One of the biggest missteps I ever made strategically on this team was presenting us as, we need to preserve Google's culture. That's what I said. I was like, we are 150,000 people now. That's bigger than Berkeley. We're in every single time zone. We're in dozens of countries. And everyone is concerned that our culture is dying and we need to preserve it. And that's super wrong. And it's super wrong because you preserve dead things. Like our culture wasn't dead at all. If anything, there was actually more passion around what our culture meant or what our culture should be than there ever was before, even though people were feeling that as like TGIF was happening less and less frequently, that Google was changing for the worse, and we, needed all of this stuff. And instead, the way that we presented it much more successfully going forward was we needed to evolve our culture. That was a more positive framing of it. That was also realistic. The way that we worked at 10,000 people didn't work the same way at 150,000 people. Some people were really upset with the way that we changed things and the way that we did things. Most of them like it quite a bit. We know that people now today feel more included than they did before. We know that people who are group moderators of their own spaces feel more ownership of their community than they did before. We know that when people see thing like guidelines or a moderation action or something like that, when it comes to respectful conversations, they're 3 times more likely to say that Google's doing the right thing than people who haven't seen an action take place. So I think that, Marcus, to your point around like, it just doesn't work the same way anymore, being confident that you do have something to evolve, that you can't just keep it the same way it was, that you have to make the tough decisions sometimes, that's important.
That's really fascinating. And Carter, thanks for explaining that language change, because I have used, and I think have been using, preserving, the word preserving culture in conversations that I've had just with team members and on my own team. And that's such a great way to change the perspective, because it's about evolving the culture, like you said. And I also think it's about educating people on what the culture is, because what you said, Marcus, is you can't just make the assumption that it's going to continue. It's not just there. It's not a solid thing that's always going to be part of the company. It takes work, and it takes input, and it takes iterations to make sure that it's still working for the people in the company as we grow. So thanks for challenging the way I've been thinking about it. Jessica, do you want to ask this last question before we do the AMA?
I do. So, and this, again, it leads really well into it. So as individual contributors and managers, what can people do to be a part of maybe that evolution of company culture? And how does that differ from upper management and executive leadership? How do we all fit into this culture evolution process?
To me, the answer is easy. We all fit in, because that's the only way to form and build up a culture. There's no way for a company to dictate a culture from a top-down level. You can set a framework, you can set the values and the vision, but it takes each and every individual on a team in the company to develop, form, and contribute to the culture. And if you really manage to build up this sense of belonging for everybody in the company, that actually makes an organization extremely resilient. And what I'm seeing a lot, the way we do it, we have culture champions in all different levels, in all different forms. And especially if you go through a phase of very rapid growth of a company, there is no culture onboarding document. Well, there is one, but it doesn't work. Right? So you need everybody around you to basically tell the new person what the culture is, get them excited, get them really fascinated, and invite them in to contribute. And every new person is changing the culture again, right? It's not about one static framework we have built and that won't change. As we grow and we get so much diverse insights from other companies and other people joining us, that the culture is always evolving, to Carter's point, but it's really something everybody carries forward. It's not the company owns a culture and dictates it.
Yeah, my initial reaction was stop looking at levels when you're talking about culture. The genesis of the internal community management team, I was an L4 individual contributor that joined an engineering team at negative headcount, which means that I left my old team that was paying me and became an accounting error at Google, because I felt ownership of the way that we should discuss communities inside of the company and the way that we should form connection. That spun out into a bigger team and a real team, and then I started reporting to Markus, which was fantastic. And it's one of those things where if people don't feel that ownership, and if people don't feel like they can change something with it, your culture is not enforceable. And that also doesn't mean that your culture won't change. There'll be people who will challenge you. I challenge Google, right? Like we said, this isn't the right way for us to do things anymore. And that applies to your, soccer club, and it applies to your project alias as well. It doesn't actually matter. So I think that one of the things that we try to do is scale that ownership across more people. When we started, we were 2 people at negative headcount. And now if you're talking about who, owns culture, who cares to guide it, we have over 1,500 volunteer moderators at Google. It's amazing. Now we have a group of people who are setting it in all sorts of different places. The owner of our politics alias is a vice president. A vice president at Google moderates our politics alias. Why? Like, he just cares. He loves it. He just wants people to engage in successful debate. And then an L3 owns our Pokemon Go community. Like, they do the same thing. And they're doing the exact same thing for the same number of people as well. It's kind of wild. And I think that the only reason that it's successful at Google is because we tell everyone that they have stake, that they can change things. They have, Marcus, to your point, the same vision and overall guidance, but different ways to accomplish it themselves, and then the ability to learn from each other what's working and what's not working. Like, culture gets set in those little small moments, not in the onboarding.
Well said. I love that. That's a really useful way to think about it. Thank you for that. Yeah, I want to turn it over to the questions here, because we have a ton of them that are streaming in quickly. So Shem, are you online? Do you want to read your question? Going once. Okay, I'll read it for Shem. So Shem's question is, as individuals are more politically activated than ever and different views are generally in a strained state of polarization, how do you prevent non-inclusive political slant from leaching into company culture? So this goes back to your politics alias, especially when wider industry politics lean in a particular direction.
I will take that one first. I want to zoom out just a little bit. Why are you even allowed to talk about politics at work? Like, doesn't that seem like a really bad idea? Like, didn't Google not learn our lesson with that Wired article that said 3 years of misery inside of Silicon Valley's happiest company? Why did we make such a dumb move to keep that kind of conversation at the company? The reason why is because Google builds the most helpful products for the most diverse set of users in the world, period. How could we do that if we can't talk to each other about the trans experience? How could we build pronouns into our tools successfully without engaging with everyone? How could we build cameras in the Pixel 6 that see darker skin tones better without talking about race? Those conversations at Google, we don't believe should be sandboxed to the individual product teams that are working on them. We believe that everyone should be able to use each other as a resource and have these serendipitous moments that may become better informed products in the future. We don't have the lunchroom as much as we used to. But the reason we have free lunch is not so that we can eat. I mean, it's nice to eat. But the reason why we have it is so that we can build those connections with each other. And so that we can have those aha moments that help us build better things. And now that we're hybrid, I know, there's a lot of theories around hybrid and remote, and we're talking to GitLab here, but Google's hybrid. And so how do we make sure that our spaces are safe and successful in talking about those things so that we can build helpful products, so that we can use every company as a resource? And the answer to that, zooming back into the question a little bit more, is actually really straightforward. And you need to be able to set appropriate expectations with Googlers and then react to content. It's that easy. It's the same principle as something that you would do externally, where you would say, here are guidelines, here's a content reporting module, and then here's the process for how we do it, and here's our transparency report at the end of the year, and what we took down and why. Those are external community management best practices that we've applied directly internally. We treat everyone the same. We don't special case anyone. You can't name call, whether you're on the right or the left, can't do it. You please rephrase the question. And so we're very principle focused in how we do that. And it takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of pain sometimes, and it takes a lot of expectation resetting. But I hope that that answered the question. If anyone else has anything to add.
Wow, I think that's why you always bring the expert in these topics. It's the most complete answer. The fun thing, like, it sounds very obvious the way we do it. It is now. It hasn't been that way. Like, those decisions, which in retrospect seem natural or logical, they take hours and hours of like very high level discussions on different levels at Google. And like the first step is like, give those topics a forum, give them a place in like the company strategy, in the leads meetings. They don't fall from sky, right? It's really, really hard to make these discussions. They're very nuanced, and oftentimes, as you mentioned in the beginning, the instinctive reaction would be different, maybe, right? But then you have to zoom out and think about like this whole picture to really figure out, do you want to solve like a short-term, like current problem? And like the answer might be yes, you just shut down the channel or like the community. Or do you want to become a long-term better company based on like your responsibility to your customers, to like the surrounding ecosystem you're in? And that is actually a non-easy decision to make, right? So it's very interesting to see that.
Thank you both for answering that one. I'm going to move us on to this next one. And I think I saw Heather on the call. Do you want to voice your question, Heather?
Sure,
And
yeah.
you can make it.
Thank you. And sorry that I'm late. So if you covered this, excuse me. And I think this, Markus, you referred to this, but I believe our team members play a crucial active role in ensuring that we maintain and strengthen our values as we scale. How do we ensure that team members, especially individual contributors, still feel comfortable with reminding anyone in the company about our values, including with managers and leadership? What are some actions managers and leaders can take to reinforce this and provide psychological safety, and any tips for ICs to ensure comfort?
That's an interesting question. Like, for the most part, it's not like actively reminding people on they are doing anything wrong and have to remind you to basically get back in line and comply to these values. For the most part, it's a lived culture, like the way we behave, the way we talk to each other, the way we run meetings. A lot of that just transports like the values of like inclusion, respect, like all of that. That's just what people are seeing every day, right? When it comes to actively like chiming in, like we had like whatever microaggressions in meetings, right? There's zero tolerance to that. We are constantly encouraging people to chime in. We give them different ways of doing that. Like, people might not feel comfortable doing this in a meeting. They might rather want to report something or have different channels. So there's multiple avenues people can take to raise their concerns. And teams like Carter's teams are helping. They help Googlers to feel confident to raise these concerns, because they don't always become, or like they don't become an HR issue, right? Like, it's not that like HR is like moving in and like just fixing stuff in a very like policing kind of way. It is the community which is self-healing. But a team like Carter's team is part of the community. They're not part of an HR team, for example. Does this answer?
Oh,
Carter, come in.
Were you going to say something, Carter? Go ahead.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, helping people feel empowered to say something means they need to understand it first, right? Like, what does googly mean? Like, we could like rabbit hole on that all day if we wanted to, and we have. But like, what does it mean to be googly? What does it mean to be that way? Again, I don't know if that happens, in a big onboarding session. But I will say that, this is actually a moment where I think managers really matter a lot. Having Markus as my manager, Markus, I'll give you a big plug here. He talked about those things openly. He said, hey, call us out, say something. He would say when something was hard, or he would say when something went wrong in a meeting and set the right example. I think that's where, you know, people just feel more encouraged when they have something to look to and be like, hey, that person did that, maybe I should do that. And setting it in the same way that a community manager or social media manager might curate content to put at the top of their app to say, hey, like, this is what we want to see and we'll reward you with it. It's the same principle, just managers and meetings. And you have to articulate it over and over and over again, over and over and over. So that's all I would add.
I want to just add, like, in my own experience, I call out my own manager on the call, Josh. He always makes me feel like really comfortable to provide feedback to him, which makes me feel more comfortable to provide feedback and speak up with other people at the company. And I think that if managers can establish that kind of relationship with their direct reports, that can be so empowering for people like me who want to go give feedback to people who maybe I don't have as close a relationship with as like the people on my direct team. So thanks, Josh. Darren, you have the next question. Do you want to voice it?
Awesome. Thanks to you both for contributing this session to GitLab. It's very valuable and we appreciate the time. So in the global remote conversation, it very often turns to fear-based conversation. Because of remote, we can't do X. So I want to flip that. What opportunities do leaders and individuals alike have to contribute to and evolve culture in this more remote than ever before type of work environment?
I can start. Like, I was always, I like your professional audio system, by the way. I was always the one person being remote in Munich. Like, most of my meetings have been like with 10 people in Mountain View, me alone in a room in Munich. This being fully remote, which we lived through in like the COVID work from home phase as Google, has turned my like inclusion level up a lot. Because we all have been like the same size, small tile on the screen in meetings. We had the same way of like contributing in a meeting. We had the same physical distance, if you will, in a meeting. So that changed my personal feeling of belonging and inclusion dramatically. So I think in many ways, a fully remote company is actually advanced in those topics than this kind of very unequal behavior. You see, like, if a bigger group comes together in a single place, it is human nature. Like, they form different bonds. They talk differently in a meeting. They meet after the meeting in like the micro kitchens or like some social areas. That you can't replicate. So being fully remote actually is an opportunity in that sense, right?
We have a case of the Zoomies in the Gibson household. There's the other one. Okay, if you want to see, there they are. We love them. Dog butt. So, you know, when we talk about contributing to culture and when we talk about setting norms, that's great to do. It's cool, but why? Right? Like what do you actually get from that besides a better work environment? Google always had this, like, and we still have it, this 20% program where you could spend 20% of your time doing something else that made Google better. It was pretty cool. That's how this team started, technically. And, you know, Google's more than the sum of its OKRs as well. There are certain things that need to happen at Google that are not OKRs, like interviewing or culture clubs or, you know, whatever. And I think that what we're trying to do going forward is really find a way to define those as community contributions and reward them, to articulate what it means to make Google better, what it means to have a cultural contribution inside the company, and then like how we mix that into our performance reviews, how we mix that into manager trainings, how we socialize that across the organization. That's a process that, you know, just because of Google's scale that we had to do. I don't think that works for every company, right? Like, you may not need a very clear definition of community contribution or very clear performance review. Like, it might you just might be like, hey, that person's awesome, therefore we should do it. But at Google, we had to formalize it a little bit more. And so that's something that I think is very, very helpful in getting people to engage in it more precisely. You have to reward people.
Cool. I think I got the next question.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carter and Marcus, for doing this. This is really insightful. So I'm curious, you know, I've been to the Mountain View Google offices before, and they're pretty ridiculous, right? They've got free food on every floor. You've got buses that you can take all the way from Santa Cruz into Mountain View for free and do your Wi-Fi on there. You can eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Amazing restaurants all over the place. And I imagine every Google office is like that, but all of that went away during the pandemic. So I'm curious, you know, I feel like that probably played a lot into Google's culture, you know, having those forums and those awesome perks that you all have into the culture of Google. But with the pandemic, all of that went away. So I'm curious, like, what have you seen in terms of maintaining that culture because you don't have those forums anymore? Like, how's that going, basically?
I think your observation is right. Like, Google has a very office-centric culture. Like, a lot of our biggest culture values are like represented in the offices or like in our cafes and the way we kind of interact. No surprise, like the food question came up as like the first question on day one when we all sent the people home. We did not send them food. Too bad. I think we were living off this culture as we have built, but you can tell it's actually slowly wearing off, right? So people at home, there's no difference if I work for company A or company B in my setup, in my surrounding. So you basically need to transform culture a lot more into like a digital collaboration as well. So I've seen your GitLab handbook. If you don't have anything like that, I think that's really something super interesting. And like we never had to basically build a non-physical culture around us, and like this is certainly something we could learn from like a remote company as well. But still, many of like the values and the beliefs the company very strongly holds, they still keep going. Like the one thing we have done just the day one after work from home, we did bring back like the TJF once in a week or once in a month meeting. Like people are hungry to see the leads. They want to see them, they want to feel them, they want a very authentic message coming from them. I think during this crisis and the way Google did not just like treat the employees, but treat everybody who worked at Google, including like vendor companies and stuff like that, was a very great moment, which is a very, very uniting moment for the company as well, to see that we actually care not just about the business, but about the human beings who are doing the business first and foremost, right? So that was a very amazing culture piece, and I think Sundar did an amazing job in really kind of representing our values on stage.
I still remember where I was and exactly what I felt and exactly what I was looking at when I got the heads up from internal comms that we were about to go full remote because of COVID. I'm really not sure if it's PTSD or if I'm excited about it or like how I feel. I think I need more processing time. But what I did know is I was like, holy shit, our online communities that used to be auxiliary ways that we connected with each other are about to be the primary way that we connect with each other for an undetermined amount of time. My team is 3 people. Like, maybe it is PTSD. Maybe I'm like, I don't know, but like, it was this like kind of amazing, yeah, yikes, woof, whatever you want to say. It was like, it was terrifying. And I think that one of the things that we had to do as a charter of our team is set new expectations. We're against the clock. One of the clocks was the 2020 election. And we were like, we're going to have only remote stuff for the, oh my gosh, like what are we actually going to do here? What do we need to do before we get there, knowing that this is the main way people are going to engage? It was hard, and it was really scary. But, you know, it's also a good way to get headcount, a good way to grow the team, a good way to carve out, you know, your experience and figure out what you needed to do and prove it out, as opposed to doing pilots. I think, yeah, it was, I don't know, it was just scary. Markus, what did you feel when we all had to go remote? Sorry, this is like slightly off topic, but you were remote. So were you like, or remote for us?
Different remote, like, well, not actually culture related. My biggest concern was like, oh my God, are we actually ready for like really all work off of a laptop we gave people? Like, can we actually run and keep our business running? And it did work out well, surprisingly well. But then many, like this whole like sending people home was so difficult in like so many ways. Like, do people have a space to sit at home? Like, many people moved to New York, especially, tiny apartment, no kitchen, no fridge, because they got all the food every day at the office. So how on earth do they kind of work from home? Some people I met have been sharing their bedroom because they have been in the same apartment. So somebody was sitting in the kitchen, somebody was sitting on the bed to just get work done, right? And that was a very interesting moment, because like, people did not join company to work from home, right? We never asked people to do any of that.
The other thing too, Josh, to your point about like perks and stuff more precisely, like people had kind of forgotten why we had those things. Like so when I joined Google, I always loved that we had free food because I got to meet people. And I loved MK because I would run into people. And I loved the bus because I had to love the bus, right? The bus was what it was. And thankfully I don't get motion sick and could do a bunch of IC work. I think the pandemic and going full remote helped us realize, in the absence of those perks, why we had them in the first place. It was all about connection. And so what we thought about was not replacing it with a monetary value, right? We didn't want to do some calculation and figure out that your food is worth exactly this, therefore you'll get this every day, yada, yada, yada. What I tried to think about, and I think I have more language for it now than I did when it first happened, in retrospect and hindsight, is we wanted to fill the gap of the purpose that those things had, which was bringing people together and helping them have serendipitous moments. So I think once we angled in on that and we told Googlers that that's what we were doing, that's what we were focusing on, we weren't stifling conversation. You weren't not going to be able to talk to your coworkers anymore. Like, I think that helped them get it a little bit better. And, you know, there are entitled Googlers for sure. But I would say that it's like an unpopular opinion to be like, where's my free food?
Yes, I think there's one specific culture, asset, or value which also helped us. Like, we have a very get things done mentality, and like very kind of giving very much autonomy back to the teams and every individual. So the moment people were sent home, they felt encouraged to just make it work. And I've seen a lot of very creative ideas. I've seen people building like their own like standing desks at home and like stuff like that. In many other companies, they would just look back to their manager and to the company and say, well, I need that and that until I get this, I can't work, right? So like people just made it work somehow, and then we kind of filled in the gaps as a company. But people have been productive on day one, which was really surprising.
Great. Thank you both. We're just at time, so I'm going to wrap things up. And we have one more question in the doc that maybe Carter and Markus, if you want to just like respond in the Google document once we get off this call, would be great. But just wanted to say a huge thank you to both of you for taking some time out. I feel like I've learned a lot from this discussion, and I hope everyone else has too. I'll post the recording in the handbook soon. And yeah, thank you again.
Amazing. A pleasure.
Yes, thank you all so much. And thanks, Samantha, for making this happen.
Of course. Thank you too, Jessica.
Thank you for having us.
Talk to y'all soon.
Bye.
Bye.